Okay, good morning. I want to talk seriously about what my own obligations are given all the activism pressure on me. Let me just by first showing you one childhood item, a stadium I made as a child in the 1950s, a model stadium, a pinball stadium. But anyway, let me get on now to the talk. Can't find the Word doc there. Okay. Let's just take a look first of all at what both sides really want in this culture war, what we call the culture war. The right kind of wants fitness, wants individuals to be fit, and prove themselves within the hierarchical family, a tribal national structure, and people in that kind of a structure where their group is kind of the tribe and the nation they belong to, they find a lot of satisfaction in the purity of the people they're associated with, connected to, even if they can't be that competitive themselves. The left, on the other hand, wants to stretch a hierarchy of oppression. And it kind of demands that privileged individuals like myself, I don't really belong to any group, any identity group as such in a way that's meaningful. Join in and taking sides publicly and helping them. For example, with anti-racism. So, for example, Black and Latino or indigenous people may have fallen further behind, recently under the extreme capitalism that we've had, but particularly since the year 2000 under Bush, and it kind of continued under Obama. The improvements that people of color had starting in the 60s and continued through the 90s as individuals, many people doing very, very well, like in media and in politics and so forth. But the progress has slowed down, and that may indeed be due more to structural racism than we thought. And so, yeah, it's appropriate to teach the effect of structural racism, and as an academic idea to teach some critical theory. It's when you start imposing it on people after you're teaching it is that there's a problem. But of course, it's hard to teach it if you're not going to practice it, I guess. And then there's the gender theory thing that the left maintains that transgender people are more oppressed than cis women are. It's a sort of conflict of interest, as some Australian site this morning said. So they go way over the line, endangering women's spaces, and they may go way over the line in presenting material to kids in lower grades in school systems now. The kids' brains are just not ready to accept and make commitments that kids should not, decisions kids should not be making at the age that they're making. And I'm quite concerned about that. They're doing things that I would have thought would have been criminal a few years ago with the age of consent and everything. So I'm really kind of shocked at this development. But what I really wanted to talk about was the individuals of the idea that there are levels of personal agency. You can belong to a group and see yourself as acting part of a group, which many people, particularly on the left, do. And people on the right do it too. When they get into talking about population demographics, they start losing their sense of themselves as individuals, and again, they care more about the supposed superiority of their race. But anyway, there's the issue of acting as a lone wolf with not very much going on in between. So what does an individual like me, do about that? Well, my own history, going back, many years, I was expelled from William and Mary as a freshman in '61. I was sort of forced out in a way in a complicated event that was bizarre in many ways that had happened. I was in the closet, forced in the closet, but I had a second coming I actually served in the military, and I've told you about that. I had a second coming of sorts in 1973, and then I had a mainframe information technology career for 32 years. And in the 90s, I decided when the gays in the military issue came up, I decided to tell my story and writing books. So my own agency as a person sort of had two phases. One was not being competitive socially. Since I wasn't competitive socially, I had to build up myself as an individual. So I had lots of possessions, a record collection that was important, I identified with classical music. I developed skill in chess, and I had a lot of personal mobility. I went a lot of places by myself when I didn't have companions, and that meant something to me. In the energy crisis in the fall of 1973, which was just after my so-called second coming, I got moved into New York City in 1974, and then I started, after some relationship issue and so forth, I decided I'd have more freedom and independence if I actually moved to a more conservative area, even though I wanted to be free as an individual, so more libertarian. So I moved to Dallas, and I was pretty locally effective with my speech during the AIDS crisis, getting to know doctors and politicians and so forth in Dallas. I was very effective as a person even before we had an internet back in the middle and late 1980s. And when I came back is when Bill Clinton was elected and gays in the military came up. I decided after a while to write the books, and then I went online. More than selling books, I went online and developed websites that were visited and just was simply found by a lot of people with search engines, even without using conventional social media or algorithms. So that's how I developed my reputation, and that itself turns out to be a little bit controversial. So I have to deal with the censorship threats from both the right and the left. And both the right and the left are guilty of it. The other term I wanted to mention was great replacement. I was thinking of that earlier when I was talking about some of the right's extreme ideas. But anyway, in government, and particularly from the point of view of the left, the government is one entity that enforces censorship, particularly outside the United States and Europe and Canada. And the tech industry has really almost acted as a second government, imposing its own standards, particularly as we've had with Twitter before Elon Musk took over, and with Patreon and even financial institutions sometimes banning people. It sort of started getting serious in 2018. So both the right and the left can practice censorship and cancel culture in their own ways. Now, my own personal impression then is, what am I supposed to do about it? Because I don't really identify as anything. I don't have an identity that much transcends myself as a person. I mean, yeah, I've been attached to rooting for baseball teams in the past and feeling bad when they lose, and that's a little bit of a, sort of a primitive side of tribalism. That's why I showed you that stadium at the beginning of the video. But it didn't really mean anything. I don't fight. I don't join others and demonstrate and fight, and I never really did very much, even after Stonewall. But I think personally, what should be expected. I've been somewhat privileged because, despite the fact that I was not able to compete as a male well when I was younger, and that there may have been reasons for that, like having the measles and so forth when I was 7. There could have been medical reasons for that were never fully explained. I was fortunate that my parents became more supportive, and I got through life on my own pretty well off, and actually inherited an estate at the end and so forth. So for me, And what I hear from particularly the left is, oh, you have to join us, and you should, as a price for being online, you have to broadcast our message for us before you're allowed to do what you want. That seems to be what the left wants. They haven't been able to enforce it, but and the left is also preoccupied with statues and all kinds of other group symbols and so forth. What I think as an individual is that's important is the demonstration of some personal fitness, that idea you get from the right. Don't be a mooch, don't be a parasite, don't be overly dependent on the ability to always pay for something you couldn't do yourself. And we're finding out post-COVID that's, and as things change, that's breaking down. You may have to do a lot more for yourself in the future if there are major disruptions because of climate change or EMP or power grid problems or something. That may be very important in the future. Demonstrate that you could have held down a menial job when it was your turn to. Do some volunteerism, be committed to it, and particularly share reasonably fairly in your exposure to personal risks. The military draft of the past, which applies the selective service registration, still applies only to biological males that were born as males. That's still true. My own record when I was living with my mother after I came back from Minnesota, I lived in Minneapolis for 6 years, had a corporate transfer, and when I came back in 2003, I lived in her house until she passed away, and then essentially inherited, or the trust inherited it. But there were times when I could have been expected to take jobs that I didn't really want to take. I'm not going over them here, maybe in another video, but I sort of got out of doing things that a lot of other people have to do, even if the things that people think they have to do, like get out and sell and call people and pester people to make quotas and so forth, are themselves dubious. I sort of got out of doing those things when maybe I shouldn't have gotten out of them. And another issue that could come up is being caught in some sort of reparations situation. That's not really happening to property now, but you could imagine that it could in the future if things become more extreme. And also to realize that in extreme cases, individual behavior that seems moochy or lazy might be viewed as criminal if your political system were to turn authoritarian, either to the right or the left. And it might lead to uncontrollable or extra legal losses. If you lose something, if something's taken away from you by a hacker or by some sort of circumstances that isn't completely within the normal way the law is supposed to operate, you don't get it back. It's still on you, or it's still on me in my case. I have to deal with it. There might get into that more later in another video. So speech that doesn't pay its own way, might be underlining legitimate political participation, even by people like me, and leaving the knocking on doors and the demonstrations and the marching and protests of the people that are more extreme. And then the people that are more extreme, we have a very polarized war, a polarized cultural war as expense. Whereas the people in the middle that are more like me are sort of just acting on their own and not joining anything. That in itself could be problematical. I just wanted to mention a couple of other things here. I call it the David Hogg effect. And David Hogg, when he had a rally last summer, it was actually on Pride Saturday in June. It was a coincidental on the Washington Monuments grounds. Was telling people personally, activists that were in the crowd, that he would need them to do things. He would personally ask them to do things, like go and visit senators or go and join other protests and so forth. When I need you there, you have people that are charismatic, and they make very good intentions. They have very good intentions in fighting for a very worthy cause. In this case, reasonable control of weapons, of military weapons access, for example. But sometimes they have to use authoritarian measures themselves to get people involved. And then the other thing is, the issue is speaking for myself and blogging. I do a lot of hyperlinking and blogging, and I've done that for years, and embedding. And that's never been questioned very much in the past. It might be questioned more in the future. You're seeing, all the major publications now have paywalls. So I sort of expect when somebody reads a blog post of mine and see a link that they've subscribed to the article I've linked to. That's their responsibility. But that could become there could be a link tag someday or something that could become a problem. I'll just show you also, again, this is my book page. And I just want to read you a passage from page 10 of the third book, The Speech is a Fundamental Right, Being Listened to is a Privilege. I think your idea is something like this. People have to step up to challenges related to the real needs of others around them, often in circumstances they didn't get to choose. A particularly striking example in my own life concerned the Vietnam-era military draft countered by deferments. You see, making everyone pay his dues as a way of to bring some underlying fairness and common meaning into the lives of others, whose circumstances will always be economically and politically unequal. You believe that navigating this test satisfactorily tends to lead one into stable, permanent relationships that express emotional complementarity or polarity, usually traditional marriage with children, and responsibility for other generations in both directions. In time, the unchosen challenges become more about the emotion and domestic needs and less about external threats. For example, the increased needs for elder care with longer lifespans when people have fewer children. You'll notice that particular passage really focuses on what I have to do as an individual, not what I do because I'm loyal to a tribe or to an identity group or to an intersection of identities. So that is sort of a right-wing way of thinking. So thank you again for your attention today.